Honorable Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. I'm Jacob Schreiner Briggs on behalf of the United States federal government. The issue before us today deals with the executive branch's plenary authority and responsibility to preserve the national security of the United States, and President Trump's executive order pertaining to travel restrictions is an exercise in that authority and responsibility to maintain national security in the United States of America.
Mr. Briggs, did Donald Trump tweet on June 5th, "People, the lawyers, and the courts can call it whatever they want, but I am calling it what we need and what it is, and in all caps, travel ban, exclamation point."
Two responses to that question, Your Honor. The first is that the president tweets a lot of things, and we're not entirely sure what they mean here at the DOJ. We can refer you to the record where he tweeted Kofifi. But the second response, and perhaps more importantly, Your Honor, is that we're dealing with the second executive order, which is clearly not a travel ban. It's a nuanced exercise of presidential authority to preserve
Then
national
perhaps
security.
you can explain why a few minutes later he tweeted, "The Justice Department should have stayed with the original travel ban, not the watered-down, politically correct version they submitted to the Supreme Court."
Your Honor, we need to be careful to look at what the president has done, less than we examine what the president has said. And what the president...
So perhaps you can explain why he also tweeted, "It doesn't matter what Mr. Schreiner Briggs says in court, this is a Muslim ban."
I can't do this anymore. I quit.
Are you leaving?
I think his tweet about the DOJ was meant to obfuscate. He's trying to make the new policy seem less like the old policy, and he did that deliberately. I mean, maybe not, because his brain is mush, but it did sort of seem like someone told him to do that. Like, look, go on Twitter and say you don't even like the new policy, that it's not even, like you wanted the old policy, but the new policy is completely different and it's bad, but you'll take it anyway. But you're not happy with your own people or something, and maybe the courts will be more amenable to it. Like, well, he did tweet that he doesn't like it, but...
So at that point, the sequence would be, Trump is so xenophobic and racist that the fact that he doesn't like this actually helps the case of the United States government in terms
exactly.
of...
Yes, exactly.
That's the most... I mean, it just might work.
I mean, that was my initial thing. But then again, the guy, I don't know, like I said, his brain is like...
Yeah, that attributes a high level of rationality to Donald Trump.
I don't want to give him this 4D chess.
15D chess.
The art of the deal.
Hello, and welcome to the Think Twice podcast. I'm Jordan Ewell.
And I'm Jacob Schreiner Briggs.
And with us today is Sam Knight of the District Sentinel.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Sam. Before we get started, we just want to thank our new Patreon subscribers, the White Brothers, and encourage other people who have a few bucks to spend every month, $5 a month, just one beer or one latte a month, chip in and help keep us going. And you can also subscribe now on iTunes and in the Google Play Store, and Think Twice is always available on SoundCloud and on our website, thinktwicepodcast.com. So right before we started today, we saw the Intercept break a story about alleged Russian attempts of infiltrating voter rolls and voter registration data. Sam, Jake, what do you guys think about that?
It was a hell of a headline, a pretty well-written story. The report itself, as it noted, contained no raw intelligence. It was an NSA analysis, But it certainly seemed to lend more credence, as the story noted, it lended more credence to the unclassified ODNI report that had come out in January about alleged Russian interference in the election. Uh, that report seemed to more focus on the output of Russian state media than anything else, and so it did contribute, I think, to understanding, at least understanding of where the intelligence agencies are coming from, and uh, seems to at least make a stronger case that there was a broad Russian uh, military intelligence attempt to impact the outcome of the 2016 election.
So my take on it, and in a prior conversation I had with Jordan, was that even if you assume that there was no tangible impact that resulted from the Russian infiltration into the voter roll databases, which isn't too outlandish of an assumption. If you read the Intercept story, it makes it pretty clear. Um, because our elections are so decentralized, it's hard to actually have a tangible impact on results. But take that assumption to the furthest length possible that there was no impact whatsoever. This seemingly is the first piece of concrete United States intelligence that confirms that Russia wasn't just interfering in the election with regard to leaking the DNC emails, but actually made an attempt to compromise our actual election infrastructure. And so that sends a signal pretty loudly and pretty clearly that to look at stories of Russian involvement or Russian animus towards the United States and be skeptical of them or chalk them up as being fake news or whatever it may be, this seems to largely undercut that argument because now we for the first time have evidence that the Russian government directly attempted, and even if in some small way, to compromise the integrity of the election itself, not just the politics leading up to it. So I think that's troubling, but it brings to light something that hopefully more people start to, I guess, accept the gravity of, and that is that a seemingly hostile nation state is attempting or has attempted to compromise our democratic processes. That was my biggest takeaway, anyway.
Well, I would just say that it's certainly troubling, but I would also stress that it's not, I mean, it's not necessarily, it's not concrete, it's not raw intelligence, it's just a more clearer look at the conclusions that the NSA and the intelligence community have arrived at. But insofar as a smoking gun, I mean, it doesn't. It's not that. It's not that.
That's true. That's a good point. Absent the raw intel, we don't know how the conclusions were drawn.
But it's definitely troubling, and it definitely, I don't know. It should raise more questions and skepticism of Russian activities vis-a-vis the United States.
All of these instances, and every time we talk about any Russian interference in the election, especially when it comes to condemnation of these types of acts, we need to be universal in our application of that standard, and certainly remember that the United States has a long history of meddling in elections, and sometimes openly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if it's wrong for someone else to do it to us, it's wrong for us to do it elsewhere. So
Yeah, and I mean, in 2014, in the run up to the crisis in Crimea, where Russia annexed Crimea, there was, of course, there would have been an election in Ukraine that was supposed to take place, I believe, in 12 months later in 2015.
It didn't, because there were a lot of protest movements against the Ukrainian leader at the time, Viktor Yanukovych. And while I'm not trying to say that uh, violent protests are never justified, or that I'm not trying to cast a value judgment on the Euromaidan movement at all, but there were certainly U.S. officials who were very actively encouraging that, and we've sunk billions of dollars since the fall of the Soviet Union into various factions in these satellite states, these former satellite states, that we want to tip their politics our way as well. So I while I wouldn't say that's necessarily hacking at all, on the scale that's alleged to have been done, it certainly, insofar as the meddling charge goes, and that is probably the cleanest example, one of the more clean examples of U.S. meddling. But that's just in recent times. So I just wanted to state that, something on my mind.
On this subject, when we talk about meddling or interference or just intervention, I guess in the broadest sense of the word, what are your both of your opinions on, I guess, intervention in a broad sense? So, I mean, if we're talking about a situation where, just purely hypothetical, you have a tyrannical government, you have a groundswell, a popular movement on behalf of the people, and they want to push towards a more democratic form of government. Let's say, hypothetically, the United States uh, devoted some sort of resource, or, I don't know, monetary investment, whatever it may be, to intervene and to influence in the internal affairs of that particular state. Would you view that as justifiable or defensible, or is this sort of like a categorical statement that, the United States shouldn't be intervening in the internal processes of other states at all?
I mean, just as an American, and knowing what an awful history we've had, and quite frankly, the contempt for democracy we've had abroad, and at home, but also abroad, when things don't go our way, I just wouldn't I wouldn't trust the U.S. to sort of engage in that activity and do it in good faith and do it with a good outcome. I kind of see it as akin to sort of like trying to get McDonald's to run a child nutrition program.
um,
It certainly does undermine the autonomy of the people there. If there is some semblance of a free and open election, having a foreign power intervene strips them of that right.
and I'm not trying to cloud the conversation by um, underplaying the United States' history, but just purely as a thought experiment. I mean, if it was the case that the people were in support of regime change towards a more democratic form of government, towards popular sovereignty, and the United States helped move that along, and they had good intentions. Just assume that. We can get into the actual history later, and in many cases that's obviously not the case. But taking for granted, right, this perfect hypothetical situation, does your view on intervention change at that point?
I mean, I don't know. I think that's a tough question to sort of answer in the hypothetical, or even consider in the hypothetical. I'm not. I don't know. I mean,
I feel like there's some variables.
as they say, that the devil's in the details, and I know it's kind of a weaselly politician move to say, well, I'd have to know more about the specifics, but I think, I don't know if I would rule it out categorically, but I'm inclined to say that I'm very skeptical of it as an idea, and not just for the U.S. and like sort of every country, Western, Eastern, whomever. Um, that yeah, I mean, I would have to see some very specific details, but I mean, even in recent history, for example, the intervention in Libya was people were claiming ostensibly that there was a groundswell of support for intervention to create a democratic Libya, and 6 years later, it didn't really pan out that way at all.
I think it's difficult to answer if you don't know maybe who the candidate is, what exactly they're pushing for, what the alternative is, and how that is achieved. And I don't know. I just feel like that would always result in some sort of military action or sending advisors to go like coach a militia or some faction or something. And I would just worry that it would result in some sort of bloodshed, because I think that's kind of how people that make those decisions think
You
in
have to
terms of human capital.
you have to wade into the thicket of regime change. I mean, yeah, I definitely understand those concerns, and you're right when you look to the actual history of that sort of outside influence. You don't typically see positive, sustainable results, and a lot of times you see the exact opposite. But it's interesting. It's an interesting conversation to have in the sort of theoretical realm, because now we're talking about allegations, and although you're right, the underlying intel isn't there, but increased suggestions that there's um, external actions being taken to compromise to one degree or another our processes. Although seeing that underlying intelligence would be beneficial, but it's just you get caught up in the fundamental questions in the abstract, and that is inherently difficult, and it's only complicated by the details of reality. But we're seeing more and more this sort of international intervention to shape geopolitics in a specific way. And I think it could be the case that for the first time in a long time, Americans have before them an instance of this happening to them. I know on the podcast that we recorded recently with Andrea Halupa, the point that she made near the end of it was that the people of Ukraine had long been exposed to the external influence of Russia, whereas in the United States we're highly skeptical of it, and it could be attributable to the fact that we just really in recent history haven't been directly exposed to it in the way that we're being exposed to it now. So I don't know, that's not really a question, but putting a lot on the table. I'm interested in hearing what both of you have to say about that.
I was just sort of thinking about how, back to the idea of when is it okay to intervene in another country's politics. I think sort of the most successful or okay examples of that are individuals going off and volunteering somewhere. So, for example, people who are going to volunteer with the YPG in Syria right now, or people who have volunteered, Americans who went off to volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be two left-wing causes. They're just the two that come to mind. And in that context, it seems it's kind of troubling that so many right-wing Americans seem to share an affinity for the authoritarian, traditionalist, religious mindset that not necessarily just Putin, but his entire faction in Russia that they represent. And it's important to remember that Trump would not really exist. I mean, he is a homegrown phenomenon, and right now, I much more feel like as an American who cares about civil libertarian values and such. I feel much more like the Republican Party is my enemy than the Kremlin, and we would not at all be here without that sort of that hardcore, far right support that that creates this sort of natural affinity between the Kremlin and the Republican Party. So what the question was? We need a more nuanced discussion about Russia. I mean, I think that's part of it, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's also important, yeah, to remember that there are a lot of Russians who don't like, who are not at all fans of Putin. So when a guy like James Clapper stands up and says Russians are almost genetically driven to deceive and things like that, it, it it drives a lot of the skepticism, I think, of the story.
Yeah, I think that's a demonstrably false statement and dangerous for a government official or former government official to say publicly, especially when he has a spotlight. I think, I don't know, I just think when you need to look at it like you look at every other social issue, and that there are no, I don't know, there are no blanket statements that could apply to everyone in that country. I think if you have a problem with the situation or you believe there are issues, it's between probably a handful of officials and a handful of Trump campaign folks, and to unilaterally target Russia, an enormous country like that, is just foolish. I mean, you wouldn't do that. I think most people on the left would not do that to a race or to a most other countries or to a state. I mean, look at the way they handle the Syrian refugee crisis and how they defend the entrance of or potential entrance of refugees, using that type of analysis to show how most people are not bad. But when it comes to Russia, that's not the case, and that might be a holdover from the Cold War.
And we can be mindful of the fact that when we talk about Russia, uh, and maybe people would be well served to specify that they're talking about the Russian state uh, and the Putin government, and not that they're talking about an entire country of people. Because I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. I think you can analyze Vladimir Putin, his foreign policy, his domestic policy, certain propagandistic tactics, and be critical of them without then subsequently saying something like Russians are genetically predisposed to be misleading. I mean, one does not follow from the other. So, and I don't even know if I want to call that nuance. I think I want to call that not being a psycho, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, substitute Russians in that statement for any other group, and think about how you might feel if he said that.
Yeah, that's
Well,
just textbook
Yeah,
McCarthyism, and it's just that's weird.
No, I mean Jacob does have a point that a lot of this talk is, focused on Russian state actors and the Russian government itself. And but I mean, I don't know. I have just always been very skeptical of our own government's motives, that I see a lot of it as a lot of this discussion as there's a very heavy subtext of American exceptionalism and Cold War liberalism that got in the past has gotten a lot of people killed. And I it does make me uncomfortable, and I think I have a personal knee jerk reaction to these sorts of things, even though, yes, Russia is, like many other states and many other governments, not really run by, it's run by, people who have a kind of a kleptocratic criminal outlook on things. And I don't know. It is kind of a head fuck sometimes. Even again, for example, with this Intercept piece, it it really does only show what the NSA believed. And it doesn't even say the NSA concluded one way or another that these alleged attempts were successful or not. And I think a lot, there is, whether or not it's successful, yes, it's bad. But I also think that to a certain degree, we wouldn't at all be having this conversation if Hillary Clinton had run a proper campaign. And I think it's important to not sort of lose sight of that going forward and trying to, for lack of a better phrasing, rebuild the country.
Contextualizing all of this is super important, and keeping everything into a proportional perspective, so we don't devolve into hysteria. Then on the flip side of that, um, I always feel the need to caution against being relativistic about things, for lack of a better word, I suppose. So we can say this is bad, without having to say this is bad and it caused Hillary Clinton the election. So we can maintain a principled view on things, and we can apply it to foreign states, we can apply it to our own country, and hopefully we do. Hopefully we keep everything into principled perspective when we're analyzing the moral content of actions taken by government. But I think you can strike a balance between those two concepts. I think you can evaluate rationally and apply, moral analysis to the action of, a state like Russia, assuming, of course, that the with all this smoke there is fire somewhere, without then jumping to these sort of hyperbolic conclusions about its effect on the 2016 election, or whether or not it's an indictment of an entire swath of people, and so on and so forth. So you can have honest conversations without being tribal and ridiculous and sensationalist about the implications of, take for instance, the alleged infiltration of voter roll databases by the Russian government.
And again, I mean, to sort of riff off of that, we as Americans we're really only responsible for what our own government does, which is a point that Noam Chomsky has made very well to actually it was to David Frum. He schooled from, and
Friend of the pod, David.
he said something like, why don't you criticize like China or some crap like that? And Chomsky says, well, as an American, I hold the American government accountable. It's really not that difficult. And in that context, if we have American officials going all the way to the top of the White House trying to obstruct an investigation, which may or may not turn anything up, but it's embarrassing for them, then in my opinion, that's definitely outrageous, and that's definitely worthy of, kicking up a fuss over, even if it's over someone like James Comey and the FBI, who personally and institutionally I cannot stand. But the very fact is, impeding an investigation is impeding an investigation, and that is definitely something that is probably the most troubling aspect of this whole story for me.
Mm-hmm. And that debate of proximity that between Chomsky and Frum was played out again through a third party between Glenn Greenwald and Sam Harris. And I think in that conversation, Greenwald was playing the role of Chomsky, and Harris was playing the role of Frum.
Not a surprise.
No, yeah, the analogies are there, definitely. But I think it is a question of proximity, though, not moral evaluation. So what we need to be mindful of is that when we make these sort of normative conclusions about particular actions by particular people and particular governments, I think the focus emphasized by people like Chomsky and Greenwald um, shouldn't be used to draw conclusions that, say, for instance, the United States does something wrong and that's worse than another country doing that same thing, but rather that as United States citizens, from a pragmatic standpoint, we are in a better position to hold the United States accountable for doing X on the world stage than we are positioned to hold, say, Chile accountable for doing X or China accountable for doing X. So it's not to distinguish on the normative grounds the action, but rather to emphasize the actual impact we can have in redressing the action. And that's why the focus should be domestic as opposed to international. I mean, I don't know how you guys feel about that, but that's sort of how I would translate that debate in my head to draw my own conclusions about it.
That's a message I think got lost with March for Truth, and it's like I think in the mainstream discussion of this issue, it's very rarely focused internally. It's not looking at ourselves, and it's not looking at our own government. We're focusing outward. We're blaming Russia, and we're generalizing countries and people, but at the end of the day, it boils down to how is the government acting? Are they engaging in ways that uphold our ideas of checks and balances? And it seems to, well, to me especially, it seems to be the case that they aren't. And that's why I got involved with that protest. But I think rightfully so, people were critical because they felt it drove this Russia hysteria. And a lot of the signs were Russian puns and using hammers and sickles.
It's like, come on, they're not even commies anymore. Jeez.
Yeah, right. And it's just like the issue isn't the Russian like style of government. It's what our democracy and what our representatives and what our senators are not doing to to reach an end to this issue or find out what happened. That's the issue. It's not how Russians have governed their people over the past several decades.
No, that's a good point. And you can imagine if the shoe was on the other foot, if it were allegations of Russia helping a Democratic presidential candidate, the Republicans would just like start throwing actual feces on the floor of the House and the Senate. Yeah, I mean they would just be filling diaper after diaper and basically refusing regular order, which to be fair I think Democrats should do because Republicans would do it to them. And yeah, but I mean I don't know. I think if we're talking about as well, I guess a frustrating thing for me is that if we're talking about not wanting to see anyone interfere in our elections, it's it's a hard it's a hard thing to want to try to want to have some sort of maybe national humility over because Donald Trump is such a repugnant piece of shit, and Republicans are just the worst, like bottom feeding scum. But I just think that if we're really well and truly concerned about interference in our election, it would behoove us as a country to, I don't know, maybe as well talk about what we've done abroad, including in places like Eastern Europe, because I just think that some of this talk, what I see in some of this talk about Russia meddling, like I said before, I see a subtext of American exceptionalism, similar sort of a tangent to what like the justification for the Iraq War being we want to liberate Iraq, I mean, well, if you looked at American history, you would know that America has very rarely, if at all, had any interest in liberating any country ever, period, with the exception maybe being World War II. Not maybe, that, definitely. But, and so this whole conversation, I don't know, devoid of context, it does seem to be more focused on a single election result and a kind of in the context of partisan politics rather than a genuine plea for some kind of rational approach to elections in general.
We have to be cosmopolitan about it. And so I don't think I'm disagreeing. I'll just put out the thoughts that are running through my head and see what you have to say about them. So
Sure.
Jordan, going back to what you said earlier, you said this isn't about how Russia governs. So I think it needs to be about both. So clearly, as evidenced by just report after report after report, there is an insane amount of obfuscating going on within Congress with regard to the investigations um, underway right now. And so the March for Truth is an excellent demonstration on behalf of the American people that that sort of obfuscation isn't acceptable. But then in the meantime, I think we can evaluate someone like Vladimir Putin and their foreign policy and say, normatively, look, propaganda is not good. Um, uh, Disrespect for the rule of law is not good. Disrespect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of your neighbors is not good. And now that doesn't absolve the United States from past or present wrongdoings. But if we're looking at this from a cosmopolitan viewpoint, we kind of level the playing field and we can apply these sort of judgments across the board and be honest about them without being hypocritical about them. If I'm protesting or up in arms about Russia's intrusion into our democratic processes, then it absolutely is incumbent on me to not be hypocritical if, for instance, there is solid intelligence that the United States has done an analogous thing to another country. But I don't know if the United States' history absolves other states from doing wrong either. And I don't think that's what you're suggesting, but I just wanted to be clear on that point for my own sake, I suppose. But I mean,
Sure.
love to get
No,
your thoughts on that.
I mean, I agree with that. I guess, and I don't know. I mean, I've, as organizers and private citizens, we're well within our right, I think, to bemoan the actions of Russia, the Russian government, and Vladimir Putin. But it's just, when I see a guy like, yeah, I'm not trying to necessarily single him out here, but I don't know, like Chuck Schumer or just a general Democratic official talk about, well, territorial integrity of Ukraine. It's like, well, yeah, when have you last opened your mouth about Israeli settlements? you know,
Mm-hmm.
or talking about Russian atrocities in Syria. Again, like we are encouraging, aiding, and abetting very similar atrocities in Yemen. So it does become very, I'm not trying to make this like a whataboutism sort of thing, but it just becomes about the integrity of the accuser. It would be like Mike Huckabee complaining about someone's protecting their son who killed a dog or something.
Or being a religious proselytizer.
Right, yeah. It's like, yeah, where it's like when you get these far right Christian guys complaining about far right the radical Muslim guys. It's well,
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think if you're arriving from a standpoint of rationality, I mean, insofar as that's possible for any person, I guess, but um, you're arriving from rationality to hold certain principles. one of the baseline expectations would be consistency in the application of those principles, not just when it's politically expedient to
Yeah.
refer to a principle. I
Yeah.
definitely agree with that.
And so yeah, I mean, like Jordan's, when I've read stuff that Jordan has said in the press about March for Truth, I get that. I'm behind that. I think that Americans should want and should demand a independent and clean investigation into this thing, regardless of anything else that has happened. And more than anything, even if Vladimir Putin himself clicked the hack button, insofar as a hack button exists, I am, I would be much more personally concerned with trying to indict our own people over it, so to speak. So insofar as he had help from any sort of Republican officials. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I personally wouldn't really give that much of a shit if we were to try to basically do to United Russia, his party, what Russia's done to us. Although, again, it's like, first of all, considering our history, it's like, well like how, who really, it's starting to get into like pissing contest sort of territory. And I don't know if I'm so much interested in revenge as I am just sort of normalcy, as it were.
On approaching the issue in a balanced way, people are still using this as a springboard for future actions related to impeachment,
Yeah.
thinking that because this was um, so like widely organized, the next logical step in their mind is, well, now we need to start doing impeachment actions. We got an email today saying, like, will the March for Truth join an impeachment march? And we're like, no. It's been 2 days. Like, we don't have an independent commission. It'd be antithetical to our mission, and we deliberately chose those bullet points and we chose that mission because we felt it was the best thing to do. It wasn't engaging in like scare tactics or hysteria,
Yeah.
and we didn't want to politicize it. We wanted a bipartisan thing because it's just about a functioning, healthy government, which is essential to any society. But people are letting their confirmation bias and what they want to happen to Trump because they don't like him
Yeah.
guide their rationale. And I get that. I don't like the guy, and I think I would be thrilled if he was out. But I want it to happen in a fair way because just as this hacking that has hurt the Democrats now, some are warning, well, the Republicans need to step up because it could happen to you later. I don't want a system with an unfair judicial process being used now because it could be horrible.
Well,
later.
I mean, so the dirty, not secret about impeachment is it's not really a judicial process.
Yeah.
It's a political process. I suppose that an independent investigation, excuse me, unindependent. It's hard to say unindependent investigation, a non-biased, a credible investigation, probe, inquiry, what have you, could make it very politically difficult for Republicans to not support impeachment. Like, say, if it was right in the run-up to the 2018 midterm, and you have this bombshell, blue ribbon commission report come out that said, yeah, Trump was all about the hacking, et cetera, et cetera. Then it might become, well, okay, let's try to stem the midterm tide by impeaching this guy, and plus we kind of want Pence anyway. But I guess what I'm saying is that, I suppose it would be good if Republicans came and got their boy, and I think Trump should be impeached, for emoluments more than anything at the moment. which is like, it's just insane to me that he's not divesting, and they're not even trying to make him divest. Uh, which again, I don't know, like brings us back to me sort of thinking that Republicans really and truly are the enemy here. Like they are really, like, they just do not give a shit.
Yeah, it's gonna take for them to risk losing their jobs. This Comey testimony might be a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Because depending on what he says, this could be an excuse. Because then Republicans will have something to point to and be like, oh well, now that we know that, if I mean, so
wait, but this sort of brings me back to my point about why it's important to not make, not necessarily to forget about the shortcomings of Hillary's campaign in the context of this whole mess, which is that I would, if I were you, and let's call them March for Impeachment comes up to March for Truth and said, hey, you want to march for impeachment? Well, I think we should march for nothing and start organizing right now for the 2018 midterm, because again, it's a political move. And I mean, I guess part of that is agitating for an open and honest inquiry. But I guess, yeah, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's not just going to be I mean, almost certainly there's not just going to be one sort of bombshell thing that kicks off an impeachment trial. We have to we have to win back Congress and throw out the Republicans.
It would be important that the left does it, because I think people hate Trump so much they're willing to accept Republicans as their heroes for even criticizing him. I mean, look at how many liberals have embraced some conservative members or libertarian members especially who don't help Trump with legislation, and they're heralded as heroes. I mean, for instance, the Freedom Caucus is deplorable.
Yeah.
The reason they tanked that healthcare bill was because it wasn't savage enough.
Yeah.
And Republicans or liberals were cheering because Trump lost and heralding them as the reason. But they're by no means heroes. I mean, they wanted something much, much worse.
Yeah.
And I think if Republicans to seize the opportunity, seize the moment, protect themselves at the last minute, right before 2018, started to kick off the impeachment process or did something that could severely damage Trump, or even, hey, very small chance, but if they were to impeach him, they would be safe. And we need to remember that when it was at its peak, they weren't doing anything.
Right.
They need to do it for the right reason.
Democrats need an identity, too. I mean,
yeah.
On the other side of the aisle, the Democratic Party really needs to figure out what it stands for and be clear and consistent in that message. And it doesn't need to be a monolith. I mean, I understand that even within party, politics are on a spectrum, and you're going to have more conservative Democrats and more liberal Democrats. But, I mean, if the nomination and general election campaign of Hillary Clinton taught me anything, it was that the Democrats' biggest selling point was that they weren't Republicans. And so that's fine, but it's not anything that's going to rile up a base of people. We want to know what you're for, not what you're against. And of course, I'm not trying to make the claim that the Democratic Party didn't have a platform or that Hillary Clinton didn't advocate certain policies. But there doesn't seem to be any fervor or passion or conviction. It's just, here are the talking points, going to appeal to this block of voters and that block of voters, and that's going to then build a coalition that will win me enough electoral votes to win the presidency. And it's just, that doesn't rally people. And
well, they lost gay marriage too. That was their point for several years, because that was a point you could really reach across the aisle and pull some people over.
Yeah.
And you could really cast Republicans as these hideous Neanderthal, antiquated monsters who didn't want your friends and neighbors to get married. But that's gone. That's decided. And they don't have that issue. And maybe that could have been single payer, but the Democrats weren't willing to stand behind it. And Trump was very clear: jobs, America, and just pure pandering, and that resonated with a lot of people, while Hillary was saying, I'm not him, and also pushing for the TPP.
Yeah,
So it was a toxic mix.
And the deplorable comment. I mean, I don't want to go into quantifying what percentage of the American people actually are deplorable.
I don't think that hurt her that bad. I mean, I think it was people are, to Jordan's point, more about healthcare. If you sort of right around the time she made the deplorable comment, Obamacare started taking some serious L's in the headlines in terms of, companies pulling out of exchanges,
And
premium increase. Right. And, I am currently reading Shattered right now. And literally just yesterday, I read the part where she was very much criticizing Bernie Sanders for wanting to completely relitigate healthcare instead of just like Obamacare was a great accomplishment. And that I agree with that. Obamacare in its own way was a good accomplishment. Not a great plan. I don't like the plan at all. But in terms of how it sort of changed the debate on healthcare in this country and managed to pass reform, there are definitely some admirable things that happened there. But she kind of stapled her campaign to the ACA very hard right from the start. And that was, Obama, for example, he said that, there are all these Republicans who cling to guns and religion in a very sneering sort of, less soundbitey version of deplorable, but in a very, similar way.
Yeah, the Democratic Party has this contagious aloofness, I feel like.
Right. But I guess the point is that didn't sink Obama, and I don't think the one thing I feel compelled to defend Hillary over is the deplorable comment. But to your point about the lack of a Democratic Party identity, I think a good place the Democrats could start, and I think sort of a place that the Bernie wing and the Obama-Hillary wing could really kind of get behind, would be a new Green Deal. And infrastructure, obviously a big deal. Energy is a huge deal. Global warming, etc. And also the fact that we have outsourced a lot of our country's production capacity. And I think if we were to really drive and make the case that, like, are you fucking kidding me, that environmentalism is not a job killer, it's a job creator, by an insane amount. And not only that, it would solve a lot of foreign policy problems. We wouldn't have to kiss the Saudis' ring every time not every time, whatever, every few months or years or whatever. I think that, yes, I think single payer is a winning platform, and I think oppose it at your own peril. But in the meantime, until all the non-single payer Dems get primaried, and hopefully it will happen, knock on wood. But I do think that, for example, a Green New Deal is something very simple that we could really staple or attach the party to, because it is compelling. Like, it is sort of a compelling message for the right to say, look, Democrats just want to take your jobs away with this environmental crap. They don't care about your well-being, or they don't care about the coal miner or whatever, even though the coal miner is actually getting fucked over by the natural gas industry more than any sort of regulation per se. But truth doesn't really matter in politics all the time, and so it would be, I think, a very it would excite the base, it would excite the young people, it would excite I think the more wonky people, it would excite the Keynesians, it would excite the technocrats. I don't know. I think a Green New Deal is really something that Democrats should be shouting from the rooftops.
And then you'd have a clash of ideas. That's what I want more than anything, is a genuine clash of ideas. Because so you have the Keynesian economics, the people of that mind, and I'd like to see a legitimate clash between, say, those people and the disciples of Milton Friedman. And so I'm not advocating, for the clash of ideas for the sake of ideas clashing, but if you have a political system that focuses on genuine policy and value debates that don't always devolve into mudslinging and aren't fueled by opportunism, but rather by conviction, everybody wins in the long term.
These consensuses, that's another awkward word, consensuses form around things like around the original New Deal. That's sort of fallen by the wayside, but, and of course the New Deal had its own problems.
Like the Supreme Court.
Like packing the Supreme... Oh, yeah, or the Supreme Court trying to kill things. But also, the point is, once it did pass, you had guys like Eisenhower who were... who bought into it, and Republicans bought into the New Deal principles for a very long time. And I think that in a lot of ways, we saw great leaps forward, not to sound too Maoist here or whatever, but we did see a significant improvement in the country's well-being and in the country's outlook. I think that changed the U.S. for the better in a lot of ways as a direct result of the Keynesian consensus.
Well, thank you for coming on, man. This was fun. I think we had a good discussion.
I think so too.
Yeah, if you please go follow Sam at SamKnight1.
Don't follow me, please.
Follow him. He's got a great feed.
It will reflect poorly on Jordan. Don't follow me.
I do not endorse or condone anything Sam tweets except for pictures of his dog. Visit districtsentinel.com. They've got great analysis. They're often first to hit a story or look for more of the underreported stuff. Check out their nightly newscasts on SoundCloud and iTunes, and consider subscribing to their Patreon. I think it's patreon.com/districtsentinel.
Correct.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, man. We really had fun.
Thanks. I had a good time.
Thank you, Sam.
Cool.
Thanks, Jacob.
If you like what you've heard today and want to support the podcast, follow us on Twitter at ThinkTwicePod and like us on Facebook at ThinkTwice.
And check out our website, thinktwicepodcast.com. And we could absolutely use your support. Please visit patreon.com/thinktwice to view subscription options. For as little as $5 a month, you can support our work. $5. That's 1 cup of coffee a month. Thank you.